Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm fine.
Good. Good to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Where are you exactly?
I'm in New Jersey, the armpit of the nation, as cynics characterize it, but we call it the Garden State. Andrew, where are you?
I know you do. What are you doing there? I didn't know you lived there. Am I out of touch?
I taught at Princeton this semester as a visiting lecturer.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And
My ex teaches there.
Really?
He teaches in the cognitive neuroscience department.
No kidding. What's his name?
His name is Andy Conway.
I don't know him, but we talked about cognitive neuroscience in the course I taught.
Well, he's becoming quite a figure in the field. He was my boyfriend before last. We dated for like 3 years. So I learned a lot from him about cognitive neuroscience, and it's an absolutely riveting field, as far as I can tell.
Andrew, love always teaches you a lot about cognitive neuroscience. And the less cognitive part of neuroscience as well.
Yes, well, it's certainly with my relationship with him that was also a factor.
Yeah, I know how that is.
He told me I was a high span, by the way.
What?
He confirmed that I was a high span.
What does that mean?
It's a technical term for a kind of brain.
Is it good?
I think it's a good thing in general.
Uh-huh. And what is it characterized by?
I don't want to garble the scholarship.
Okay.
But I think it's a function of intelligence.
You do? You put that as humbly as it could have been put, Andrew. I think it means I'm a genius, but I don't know. Who am I to say?
No, there's large numbers of people at high span. I'm sure you are, too.
Oh, it's so nice of you to say that. I'll bet you say that to all the talk show hosts.
I was just on Diane Rehm.
Were you? Did you say it to her?
No, it's just, she's not, she takes her time.
She's a medium span, then. No, she's great. It's a good show. I like her show.
Yeah, she's wonderful, actually.
Even though I've never been on it.
Have you never been on it?
I think I've been on with a guest host, actually maybe twice, but when she herself is calling the shots, they don't call Bob. But listen, I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter, Andrew. I'm not bitter.
That's all right. I know you're not bitter. You've never been bitter.
I've never been the bitter kind. So listen, Andrew, coincidentally, I've been reading your book.
Thank you very much.
I mean, it's a coincidence. Just so happened that if I wanted to get you on the show, I had to slog through. What?
We should be frank and say that I refused to do this until you'd read it. So it was really unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a distinction between compelling reading and compelled reading, but
they're not necessarily exclusive.
They're not exclusive, and I must say that although I began this book as a professional obligation, it was very easy reading. All I had to do was start reading the first page, and it went down like honey. It actually is good. I actually wound up liking it, almost to my surprise.
My fear has been that, for a variety of reasons, it won't quite get to the readers I want it to get to, but what can you do?
Well, you're not hoping to convert the fundamentalists themselves, right? Well, first we should say a little something about it. It's called The Conservative Soul. You're complaining about a certain part of the Republican Party that has kind of hijacked conservatism, I guess, from your point of view. In any event, they basically are fundamentalists, if often in a religious sense, but there's a more abstract sense in which I think you mean it. That is to say, they lack intellectual humility, they lack self-doubt, and they tend to divide the world between enemies and allies in a kind of Manichaean way, right? That's the general drift?
Yes, except I sort of also want to get into a kind of epistemological difference between people who accept the realm of empirical discovery and rational thought, as opposed to revealed truth and ideology. And I try and interpret the binary nature of our national debate between those two realms. I kind of believe, I think, that left and right are less useful now in understanding what we're really arguing about, and that fundamentalist faith and secular rationalism are really the two polarities that we are that define our politics, and that we haven't quite grappled with that. By the way, Bob, I hate to introduce, but I am getting this screaming, slight, high-pitched siren in my ear, which is a little hard to concentrate with.
It's not a good feeling?
It's not a great feeling. It just comes in at a kind of, I don't know what it's the function of.
It's not correlated with where you position your head or anything?
No, it seems to be coming from your end.
Well, it's funny. I hear a low-pitched thing that seems to be coming at your end, but let's not trade accusations here.
I'll try and work through it. I'm sorry. You can edit these things, right?
Actually, they're more entertaining if I don't. But we'll see. If you start spewing profanities, we'll see what we can do.
If I just start feeling like I'm somehow been trapped in Guantanamo and these sounds are disorienting my ability to think coherently, I'll let you know.
It's coming through the phone?
Yeah, it's coming through the ear somehow. Anyway, never mind.
Okay. Well, on this issue of relying on kind of empirically revealed evidence as opposed to kind of special access to divine truths, which is one of the polarities you're focusing on, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me that this puts you in kind of a delicate position because you are a believing Christian, and yet it just occurred. What I was wondering as I read the book is where exactly do you draw the line? There's a phrase you use about faith. What is it, like faith with doubt? And it just seemed to me that those just at some point those become mutually exclusive, right? I mean,
yes. Let me try and explain it this way. I think that every believing Christian who's grown up as a Christian, and I was brought up as a Catholic, a very strict Catholic upbringing, actually, and I think became quite a doctrinaire Catholic at one point in my life, and then sort of realized as I grew older and dealt with the world as it is, and understood more about the way human life actually is, realized that some of these doctrines just don't really give a full account of life as it is lived. And also, even from the very get-go, there were certain doctrines which, even as a 7-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old, were clear to me not terribly persuasive. I mean, I guess, for example, the assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in which we were asked to believe that she was physically whooshed up into the sky, was something that even at the age of 12, I thought, nah, I really can't believe that. I think, and not only that, but I could see that in fact it was a doctrine that had been extrapolated from the notion of the virgin birth, because Jesus was born not as a function of regular heterosexual intercourse in the Gospels accounts. The question became, how did Mary do it? And if she was impregnated in a way by God, then how could God be impregnate an imperfect human being? So she became sinless. And because she was sinless, she couldn't die. So therefore they came up with the theory of the Assumption. Now, even as a 12-year-old, I could figure out that was really something that theologians had figured out, and was clearly something that I didn't think was at the core of faith, and I didn't have to believe it. So from the very beginning, I think I was picking and choosing to some extent. But in the end, I came to sort of the belief that there were fundamental truths, core truths, that if I were to doubt or if I were to reject, would indeed render me outside of what might be called Christianity. But they were not that many. I mean, they could be the Nicene Creed itself, I think I can fully say at Mass without any particular reservations.
And that's got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost in it?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
It has the forgiveness of sins. It has the notion of the Incarnation and the notion of the resurrection. And it's what Christians sort of agreed on at a certain point in history was what they believed in. At the same time, I'm also aware that things we're asked to believe in are literally unbelievable as human beings. I mean, It is literally unbelievable to believe that someone rose from the dead and walked around. And so my solution to this quandary is the notion of mystery. That at some level, if one accepts there are things we cannot know about the meaning of the universe, then the smartest and I think the most sane approach is to accept certain things as mysteries that are in themselves just to be accepted or to be inquired into or simply marveled at as ways to explain it. In other words, the literal fundamentalist approach to religion just just fails on its own terms and is, in fact, in a state of quite serious disarray. And that we need to reconstruct a form of religious faith that is more resilient in the age of Darwin, in the age of modern science, and in the age of modern psychology and science.
Yeah, well, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, one is that in terms of how close you are to the line that some people would say disqualifies you from being a Christian, at one point you say you continue periodically to revisit the question of whether the resurrection of Jesus is meant literally or allegorically, right? If I remember correctly?
Well, I think...
And isn't it the case that many Christians would say, wait a second, there we draw the line. If you don't believe Jesus was literally resurrected, you're not a Christian.
Well, yes, except the Bible itself and the Gospels, for example, that depict Jesus' appearances after the resurrection are themselves contradictory.
Well, yes.
In some of them, they seem to be literally a human being as we understand a human being. In another section, for example, on the road to Emmaus, he seems to appear in the guise of another person and then disappear. So there are conflicting accounts within the official Gospels of what it really means for him to be risen from the dead. In the sense that I believe that, yes, he did, in his spirit and indeed perhaps manifestations of his own physical body, were clearly impressed upon the apostles and the disciples and the people who followed him after his death. That I believe. In fact, I find it utterly incredible that the Christian movement would have taken off the way it did unless something quite extraordinary happened in the period after Jesus' death. And so in that sense I do. And I also believe that what one might call the Spirit of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, who also represents the Spirit of God the Father, is absolutely a real force. And I've had experiences in my own life which I really cannot explain except by virtue of accepting the reality of that existence. However, I will also, the point of the book is simply to say, even though I believe these things, I know I cannot, for example, rationally persuade you, Bob, that they're all true. I don't really want to try and do that, because it is not that we're mixing categories here. And so I should have, as a believer, I can have a whole variety of levels of faith, as Christians all do. But as a citizen or as a political actor, I have to accept that other people in our society will utterly disagree with me, either because they will just disagree with the whole notion that we can argue about things we cannot know, or that they believe they have other truths they're absolutely certain of that contradict mine. That's just simply a political argument about how faith integrates into politics.
Okay. First of all, I would be remiss if I did not ask you if you want to elaborate on what these experiences were like when you felt the presence of Christ's Spirit, or however you would put it.
Well, I actually talk about the most vivid one I've ever had in my book, Love Undetectable, which was a sense of, I had two, I think, visions in a period of my life that vision is the only word I can use, where I felt completely overwhelmed by the presence of something that was clearly I did not invent and was clearly speaking to me in a voice that I fully understood immediately to be the Jesus that I had long prayed to and worshipped. And again, it's going to sound like insanity to people to Sam Harris or even maybe to you, but it was real to me, and I described it in Love Undetectable to some extent. To some extent, it's hard to describe. But there have also been several times, in the experience of communion, the Eucharist, where I have been overwhelmed by the sense of God's presence in a way, again, that kind of escapes words. I can just tell you that there's no reason for me to make this stuff up if I weren't convinced of it. And I think I'm not that, well, maybe I am gullible a person, but these are things I couldn't quite explain by any other way. And also there's a kind of lingering sense in my own life and psyche and soul of a very profound relationship to Jesus of the Gospels. I mean, from a child, I heard them every week, and they've become part of my, almost part of my psychological and spiritual makeup. And when I hear them, I I hear them tell the truth. I hear a very personal voice, and I still feel it with me. And that's something, again, I don't expect to convince you of. I can only hope to convey that for me it is a genuine experience.
Well, as you know, I'm more sympathetic than Sam Harris.
I know you are. I mean, because I actually think you are more genuinely, not to flatter you in any way, God forbid, but I've always thought of you as someone who's curious about these phenomena rather than dismissive of them.
Oh, I'm totally curious, and I mean, moreover, I was brought up religiously,
right.
and that's left its mark. And in fact, I mean, in this seminar I just finished teaching at Princeton, I think by the end of it I had been dismissed. I was co-teaching it with Peter Singer, and I think by the end of it I had been dismissed by him and half the class as like a lunatic, just because I was raising kind of ultimate questions about whether natural selection itself might have been set in motion for some purpose that isn't clear to us yet, or something, you know. Which to me is just
the only legitimate empirical position is to hold certain conclusions always provisionally, especially with respect to evidence that inevitably we do not yet know, or indeed just from the perspective of categorical differences. I mean, I have no problem with natural selection. I mean, I think I don't think there's any serious debate about it as a very coherent and long-lasting theory that has been very robust in its testing. But again, I don't think why such a thing, or the deeper issues behind all of that, can be resolved by such empirical research. Maybe something will show up, but and I'm a little troubled, by the way, I think, at some of the sort of atheist intolerance emerging. I think there's a strain.
I was going to ask you about Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, even if you hadn't brought Harris up. Of course, Harris wrote Letter to a Christian Nation, and before that, The End of Faith. And Dawkins, this book that's The God Delusion or whatever. And these are called kind of the new atheists. And I guess maybe they're new in the sense that they're more assertive than old atheists, or maybe their books are just selling better or something, but at the moment they are a cultural force.
They are. I think I found, I haven't read the Dawkins book because I just haven't had time since it came out. I've read Sam Harris's book, and I have to say I found them both very, very stimulating. Even where I deeply disagreed with certain things that he was saying, I found a lot of it very invigorating. I think actually Christians should read those books because I do think they force one back to ask serious questions. I mean, one of the points of my book is to say, look, if you've never really doubted something, you haven't really believed it. You've just sort of accepted it. I think there's an element of contemporary Christian fundamentalism that is really antipathetic to faith as it really exists, which is just blind submission to certain truths. And it tends to happen after one moment of being born again, after which no questions are allowed. That's never been my experience of religion. It's certainly not the Catholic experience, I think, historically. Excuse me.
How's that ringing in your ears? Is it still bad?
It's still bad, but I'm fine.
I mean, we could hang up and I could try to call you back and see if it disappeared.
No, I don't think, unless I appear to be completely incoherent to you.
You sound good. I don't know what you look like. You sound good. I'm sure you look good.
It's been a rough fall, so I'm a little haggard right now.
I know the feeling. But the on this question, I mean, you alluded earlier to the need, I think, if I heard you correctly, to lay the foundation for a religious worldview that is fully compatible with kind of modern science and so on, right? You're for that, right?
Yes, because for a simple reason, which is that if we believe as Christians that we are speaking the truth, then the empirical truth can hardly contradict us. I mean,
you would think.
We would think that a Christian would be thrilled to find new truth, because real truth cannot contradict divine truth. I mean,
unless it's a practical joke set up by God, you would think that that's the case, right?
One would imagine. I don't see why the only religious people who are afraid of Darwin are those who are afraid they're wrong.
Right. Although here I have a couple of I have a question about the way you depict evolution in the book. In the Conservative Soul, you say evolution gives us no purpose other than survival, and humans kind of flatter themselves when they look at evolution and see themselves as kind of the acme of evolution in any sense. And in depicting evolution as purposeless, I mean, here's what puzzles me. It seems to me if you believe in a creator God, and you believe that evolution was the immediate creation, the source of the immediate creation of humans, it seems to me you have to view evolution as the creative tool of God, right? So it would seem to me that it is the natural selection, or evolution by natural selection, is the medium by which God's purposes would be transmitted to human beings.
I can see that argument, yes. One of the things that affected me in writing this book and the stuff I read was going back to actually Jefferson and some of the founding fathers, whose views on religion are really quite fascinating, because what they remind us is that the 18th century was actually a period where a lot of the arguments we're having today were also occurring, and it just so happened that the American elite took the position that you and I are taking, not the fundamentalists are taking. I think a deist view of God, or a rather distant view of God, need not have quite that direct purpose. I mean, look, one of the things that I'm impressed by, one of the things that we know now in a way that we never knew before, for example, is the extent and variety of the universe. I mean, we actually have gone into space. We can actually see it. The other night I was watching on HDTV these astonishing pictures from the Hubble. When you see the immensity of the universe, as well as the extraordinary likelihood that life, and intelligent life, exists elsewhere, I just find it hard to think of a God that has that close a purpose in the pursuit of evolution. I can see God existing as a life force, a benign life force that can oversee such events. But I don't think of him. I don't think of God as, for example, pushing the emergence of the human species out of earlier, more primitive species. I just don't see that. I think as human beings, as evolved human beings, we may be the first creature on this planet to actually begin to glimpse a shard of the all-powerful consciousness that God must be. But that doesn't mean that we are somehow his design in that specific, rather precise sense. We are part of his design.
You mean we flatter ourselves to think that we are really at the center of his attention and his purpose?
I think as humans, yes. I think as individual souls with our consciousness, I think that what Jesus says, which is the critical, I think, message of Jesus, which is that God, the Almighty God that exists beyond all our understanding, actually is also connected to each of us individually as a loving, benign force. That is a remarkable doctrine. It's not the same thing as a God sort of creating or directing evolution in any kind of way.
No, it's not. No, it's not the same. And at the same time, I mean, as you know, one thing I've emphasized in my writing about evolution is that actually there is a kind of directionality in it, not in the sense that there's some mystical force pushing it along or anything, but even if the mechanism is just nuts and bolts natural selection, there manifestly is a kind of tendency toward well, the upshot is I believe the evolution of intelligence was fairly likely all along, and there are actually, among the people who agree with me on that point, are arch-atheist Dan Dennett and kind of agnostic Ed Wilson. So that's not a crazy point in itself.
No, and it may mean that in some ways that the world and life is progressing towards evolutionary forms that have a greater understanding or awareness of what God might be.
Well, and I mean, I have the further argument that actually the direction of history forces us to advance kind of morally and spiritually by forcing us into contact with people who are quite different than us, by putting us, you know, in these non-zero-sum relationships where either we kind of acknowledge their humanity and figure out a way to coexist, or it's bad for both of us, and so on. You know, I mean, I think, well, anyway.
But that could be understood simply as a more successful attempt to live together without murdering each other, which which is a more pragmatic idea rather than a more sort of...
Well, yeah. No, ultimately, I mean, ultimately, if I believe that natural selection is a creative mechanism and I have a somewhat materialist view of the way historical forces work, yes, pragmatism is the word for my view. But what I'm saying is, if pragmatic forces, nuts and bolts forces, repeatedly move, first organic life and then the human species in a particular direction, it could be a direction so pronounced and even with such a kind of moral dimension as to raise the question of whether the whole process does not have overarching purpose.
This is what I think the Founding Fathers would understand as providence. The concept that somehow all this is a little too... This is a little more than accident might suggest. And yeah, I would be open to that idea, except I think there's no way you or I will ever be able to prove it except circumstantially, and that therefore one might accept it as a mystery, and then we go into a sort of moment where one has to sort of say, well, we don't know, and maybe this is the way that God, maybe this is the way we will understand God better and better. I just want to, in the book specifically, and this is why I focus on Montaigne quite so much, was to really insist that human beings quit this sense of their own certainty with respect to the divine.
Now I see actually why you do want to kind of remove us from the pinnacle, from our self-conceived kind of pinnacle of creation,
yes,
because it is consistent with your emphasis on the need for kind of intellectual humility. Before we move on to that, let me just give you one quote from your book that was interesting to me, because it was not that far from being something I could subscribe to in at least a speculative way. Mm-hmm. You say, I call myself a Christian because I believe that, in a way I cannot fully understand, the force behind everything decided to prove itself benign by becoming us and being with us. Now, the word decided, I'm not sure I could buy into, because there you're becoming very kind of plainly theistic or something. But the idea that the force behind everything proved itself benign by becoming us, and maybe in some sense being with us, it seems to me that's an idea that you could almost call a modernist kind of, but spiritually oriented metaphysics that that would not need to rest on any claim to special revelation such as Christianity has. In other words, in a speculative way, you could look at kind of the history of life and the history of humanity and kind of say, hey, maybe this is what's going on, in I think a fairly plausible way, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and that is what I'm trying to say. For me, and I know this does lead to all sorts of theological debates, but for me, the critical doctrine of Christianity is not the resurrection, it is the incarnation. That the resurrection in some ways is just a logical consequence of the incarnation. And I think the doctrine of the resurrection, as it was fully elaborated subsequently, was, and also maybe exaggerated a little bit to fit into the notion, if God became man, how could that man die? I also think that the insight into what God is may not be restricted to Christianity. I mean, I think the other religious tradition I have enormous amount of interest and sympathy in is Buddhism, because I think that also, because I think that the parallels between Jesus and the teachings of Buddha are almost uncannily close in many ways. They're different in other...
But the Buddha got there first, Andrew.
He may well have done.
Actually, we don't know. The writing itself doesn't crystallize until well after we think he lived, so that may not be clear. But sorry, go ahead.
No, and the writing is fascinating. And I went through a period, about 15 years ago, when I sort of thought of myself in a way as a Buddhist for a while, and then I moved away from it. But yes, to me, you see, the whole issue of whether God exists or not has never been, for me, and all I can say, has never been really that big an issue. I've always assumed that God existed. I've never been able to really quite live in a universe where I think there is nothing behind all of this. The question for me was always, theologically, whether God was benign or evil. And whether his, I use this pronoun his, as short.
We know what you mean.
Okay, but God's the remarkable aspect that Christians are asked to believe is that God is good and that God is love.
Well,
that is a huge leap.
Well, good and
history.
omnipotent. I mean, both omnipotent and good, so that in theory, the world is exactly the way he wants it, and yet he's good. That right? That really kind of crystallizes the difficulty.
Yes, and then therefore, the doctrine of the fall has to come in there at some point to explain the failure of human beings as human beings to live up to what our Creator is about. But I think that's also one can understand in terms of evolutionary processes. I mean, maybe we are at an evolutionary stage where we understand part of what this is about, but not all of it, or we are also still hardwired, as you have brilliantly elaborated in various forums, to more basic impulses, and that, as I say in the book, that the definition of being human is to be trapped between those two possibilities. Animals are not trapped, so far as we know, by the sense of a divine presence that commands us and leads us towards benign actions, and struggle between that and their basic animal instincts of a whole variety of genetic impulses. We alone, so far as we know, do live with that struggle. That is the human predicament. And understanding that essentially mixed human experience is to me the critical conservative insight, because, and just to move this towards what conservatism means, it starts from the assumption that human beings' existence is imperfect and to some extent inherently tragic, because we will never transcend our roots, and yet we have a sense that we need to. And for me, Montaigne and Pascal and the 16th century writers and 17th century writers really captured that more powerfully than many others.
Mm-hmm. Now, I assure you, I am going to let you move the conversation on to political conservatism very briefly. I just want to interject.
I'm delighted to talk about this with you, because...
I mean, if worse comes to worse, I can break this up into two parts, into two different episodes, and one can be for spiritually curious people, and the other can be for the rest of them. But,
well, the thing is, I realized that I can't... What I found was that I couldn't talk about contemporary politics without grappling with these issues, because I think these issues are actually critically involved in politics right now. I mean, that we are dealing both in terms of foreign policy and to a certain extent in terms of domestic policy with religiously motivated movements that are not open to rational negotiation.
I think it's true, and I think there may be other senses in which, world events challenge our kind of what you might call our spiritual consciousness. I mean, other senses in which people like you and I have to work very hard and kind of expand our kind of moral imagination in order to make policy work right. This actually may be a point. I'll save this for the political part because it may be a point of disagreement. But let me say one more thing on the more kind of sheerly almost theological front, which is just it's interesting that you mentioned Buddhism and Christianity, because I did a 1-week silent meditation retreat at this place called the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts. And first of all, it was an incredibly profound experience. But interestingly, it was, I don't know if it's a place where nuns used to live and study, or priests. I don't know if there's like a novitiate or and a nunnery, or I don't know what the various things are. For whatever reason, there were stained glass images of Jesus in the hall that you pass through to get to the meditation hall. And, because I was brought up religiously, and because you're in this weird situation where you go a week without any news from the world, without talking to anybody back home, without talking to anybody, okay? Because you're in that kind of situation, touchstones like that were very comforting for me. And every time I went in to meditate, I had that. And I just want to, this is setting up just the following question. Mm-hmm. Suppose it turned out, I mean, the problem I have with kind of the main religions as conventionally interpreted is that they all have a claim to special revelation. If it turned out, I mean, how happy would you be with the following situation? If it turned out that on the one hand, yes, those experiences you had when you felt the presence of Jesus were kind of metaphysically legitimate? In other words, you were perceiving something real and good and hopeful about the human condition that is, or reality that is normally obscure to us, okay? But on the other hand, the fact that you associated it with Jesus was a mere, historical contingency and circumstance, and the truth is that Jesus was just a guy who died, and then they made up these stories, and a religion got started. I mean, if it turned out that that was the case, and you came to that conclusion, that in other words, there was a kind of generic validity to your religious experience, but the specific, kind of garb that it came in was not literally true, would that be a big problem for you?
I don't think it would be a big problem. It would be a slightly small problem, and I qualify it slightly by saying that I have, as any, I think, intelligent person would, explored, to some extent, other alternative religious options. As I said, I had a Buddhist where I studied the Buddhist, what literature there is, and actually had a quite extraordinary couple of experiences in the lost temples of Penang in Burma, where I meditated and felt something not unlike what I felt on those experiences where I was overwhelmed with a very personal voice of Jesus, a voice of Jesus that I think that inevitably I learned from the Gospels. So maybe if I'd never learned that stuff from the Gospels, I would have interpreted this experience in a different way. But that doesn't mean to say I don't believe Jesus himself wasn't an extraordinarily significant person who was, in the deepest sense, in touch with this greater consciousness, possibly more profoundly than anybody else who's ever lived, and that is enough for me, especially since the strength of his legacy and the strength of his message is so overpowering to my own spiritual psyche that it is enough. But I am not going to deny the possibility of other people reaching such a place through different means, because obviously God is beyond, God the Father, as Jesus called him, or God the Holy Spirit. These are concepts that by our very nature we cannot fully understand. So who knows how else they could manifest themselves. I certainly always found it problematic, the notion that God would allow just one person to represent him, and that through the accident of human history, everybody who lived before him never had a chance to understand this, and everybody afterwards who never came across him would never have a chance. Now, the usual Christian response to that is almost pathological evangelization, because, goodness, all these people don't know, therefore they're lost forever. My response is, no, maybe this is one way, but maybe there are others.
Yeah.
Now, that may cast me out. I don't think Hugh Hewitt will take that as an argument of a Christian, but and my own church may be very suspicious of that.
I'm not so sure. I actually think that now, if you look at Catholic doctrine, there's quite an openness to the prospect that salvation can be had by people who are actually not Christians. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're not wrong about that. And the Second Council specifically, I think, opened up the possibility of interreligious dialogue and also a respect for other religious traditions in a way that was not conceivable before the 1960s. And I think, I'm a Second Council Catholic. I was born in the year of the Second Vatican Council, 1963. So I never knew the previous Catholicism. When I read Chesterton or Belloc, or even Newman to some extent, it's a little distant for me. Because I think the Second Council was really an attempt by the Church to get a little bit humbler. Jesus never constructed a church and never issued a doctrine. That was Paul. Jesus just told stories and lived a life of such exemplary calm, peace, serenity, and love that anybody who came in contact with him was overwhelmed by it. That much, I think, few people would dispute. And that's what I'm increasingly resorting to. I might also add that another influence on me has been the enormous historical scholarship that has gone on in the last generation on the sources of the Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels, and the understanding that we now have that this early Christian movement was a terribly divided and contentious place where people were trying to make sense after someone had died, and disappeared from the earth, of what he meant. And so this idea that there is a monolithic truth that Jesus himself imparted is itself a historical fallacy. And a Christian who's interested in the truth is not going to ignore scholarship. I mean, they're going to use that scholarship and move on. And I think that you see great fear in institutional Christianity of exactly that scholarship, which is why Benedict has been so terrified by the prospect of it.
Yeah, but there is the fear, there is the possibility that critical scholarship could cast doubt on the thing you just said, which is that the Jesus of the Gospels, the one of peace and serenity, is the real Jesus, right? I mean, that's the fear, I think, because that's a part of doctrine that even you, as a relatively liberal in the theological sense Christian, that you hold as central, right?
I do, but I actually don't know many people that think. I mean, I think that where historical scholarship is leading, and you know, maybe I'm not completely up to the latest on it, tends not to cast doubt on those aspects of Jesus' teaching, but they tend to cast doubt a little bit on the politicized motives of the gospel writers, especially, for example, the demonization of Jews in the Gospels and so on and so forth, which seem utterly alien to what Jesus seemed to be. I mean, I think Jefferson was onto something when he read the Gospels. He saw two Gospels, the core Gospel and the extraneous Gospel. And the Jesus seminar, as you know, the scholarship seems to be revealing more and more that authentic, peace-loving Jesus is probably the real one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got a piece of writing that you may find challenging or may not.
Well, I'm open to considering those options.
I may let you see it before the rest of the world does.
Have you written it?
Yeah, kind of. It's not radical. But it's well, anyway. This is not about me, Andrew.
Well, I hope it is. I mean, it's a conversation, so it has to be partly about you.
It's a great conversation, too. This is just the way we would do it at Starbucks.
I would hope so.
Except without the ringing in your ear.
Yeah.
Now, okay, we probably at some point... Well, the final thing, I swear, the final thing I'll say is, to me, it's almost as important and kind of, reassuring or inspiring in a spiritual way that people leave aside the veracity of the Jesus story. It's almost as important to me that humankind... increasingly large groups of people came to want to see that as the Jesus story. Let's suppose it was all invented, but the fact is these doctrines had great appeal, and that seems to me a good thing. Not that, as you know, not that Christianity always has found benign form by any means, but there have been enough people who wanted to emphasize that side of the story, that side has lived on. To me, that's inspiring, and even well, I'll stop there anyway.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think that what I find amazing about the in some ways the violence and murder and mayhem that's been perpetrated by Christians is what an achievement that was, given the raw material they had to grapple with. I mean, here you have someone whose doctrine of non-violence, I don't think, in almost all respects, is very, very clear. I mean, this is a man who would not even defend himself in a court of, in a pseudo court of law, when he could have done, in order to allow violence to be done to him. To turn that into the Crusades was really quite an achievement. It's certainly more of an achievement than turning Muhammad's teachings into some sort of violence. Because I think there's much more within the Quran that would allow for that than within the Gospels. I'm not talking about the Old Testament, I'm not talking about Revelation, but within the Gospels.
The Gospels, right. Now, the Gospels are, yes, compared to Deuteronomy and Revelations, I would say that the Gospels come out looking pretty good.
Revelation to me is, I must say, there was a huge debate in the Christian history about whether it should ever be included in the Bible. The fact that it has now become, to some extent, the critical book for American fundamentalists is a deeply disturbing development. I think that Revelation is a sort of hallucination. I don't really consider it to be an integral part of the Christian message at all.
No, it's very scary. There were a number of apocalypses floating around at the time, any one of which, if they had to have an apocalypse, right, in the New Testament, any one of which could have been selected.
Yeah, but this apocalypse was on acid. I mean,
Well,
when was it? Do you
I've
ever
always
read
said-
this stuff? I mean, it makes Left Behind, seem like, I don't know, a piece in the Washington
Yeah.
Monthly. I mean, it's truly bizarre.
Yeah.
And the people who wrote it, I think, had to be hallucinating at some level.
But
I mean,
my
there are
feeling-
theories that they starved themselves in the desert and had literal hallucinations and wrote them down.
But I think if you're going to do apocalypse, you might as well shift into high gear, And when I was a kid in Sunday school, Revelation was totally my favorite book of the Bible. It was like, I guess, the closest thing to a violent video game when I was young.
Well, I was a Vatican II Catholic, so we never heard about that. You
Oh,
see,
man.
I was brought up as a liberal Catholic. That's what people don't understand. I was brought up.
I was not.
With guitars and tolerance, and we actually sang Cat Stevens' "Morning Has Broken" in my Catholic school. I mean, that's how hip it was. I mean, I never had this terribly austere Catholicism in my childhood, for which I'm enormously grateful.
Yeah, although in your book you say there was this period when you slipped into a kind of fundamentalism in a kind of socially defensive way,
Yeah,
right?
that's when I was sent to a Protestant school. I felt very defensive, and I think I then reached for certain certainty arguments that helped me maintain some sort of spiritual and psychological equilibrium. But maybe that helps me understand a little bit better how the fundamentalist psyche works. And frankly, also, I think I adopted a fundamentalist psyche to some extent, not entirely, as an attempt to control what seemed to me a homosexual orientation in adolescence. And I think that is a reaction formation psychologically, which I subsequently came to understand. And look, we see it taken to its logical conclusion in people who end up in places like Ted Haggard did. I mean, where fundamentalism becomes your medication for your own internal conflicts.
And you're talking about religious fundamentalism in your case.
In my case, other fundamentalism can exist, I think, but religious fundamentalism and its absolute phobia of any sexuality, for example, makes it a very powerful thing, because sexuality is, as you've written, an extraordinarily powerful force in human nature, especially for men.
It was not an original observation when I made it, I have to admit, but I have written it.
No, there were several people before you made this, but you've made it in an interesting contemporary way that I think is but you can see therefore why people terrified of that dimension of their lives seek absolute certainty to repress it, because anything less than that would not repress it.
Right.
And why, therefore, they can become the most extreme. When people talk about hypocrisy among someone like Ted Haggard, I think they're misunderstanding really what he's doing. He's not actively believing internally that he's just telling them one thing and doing another. He is so ashamed of his own internal psyche that it makes him all the more emphatic to prevent other people from getting there. And I think that's the syndrome.
Okay. Well, Haggerty is a good segue into actual politics. And I guess if I do break this into two episodes, which I actually may, this will be the scene.